My name is Eamon Murtagh, you probably guessed that. Welcome to What Goes Around.
My name's Deb Grant, also welcome.
Yes, we're both welcome. And so is Cherie Percy, the brilliant authoress who has brought us a new book on the 33 and a third series of books about music. And this time the focus is on the fantastic New York group ESG.
We'll also be travelling to Berlin to speak to a former DJ, now writer, called Paul Hanford, who talks about his experiences of coming to Berlin, retiring from DJing and meeting a load of interesting people.
And we've got the fabulous John Robbins of Radio 5 Live fame and my favourite Friday afternoon show on that particular station. And of course a famed and well-respected presenter and comedian who is also jolly good company and has excellent taste in music, does he not?
He does. Big Zappa fan, which gets my approval. But it's quite an emotional conversation, actually. I'm looking forward to sharing it with the listeners. Shall we pod?
Well, let's do some emotional podding. Pod. Somewhere deep in the workshop of life, there sits Deb Grant, and I'm here to ask her what goes around amongst the builders of insanity.
I am taking the workshop at the moment. I don't know what they're doing out there because I've had my blinds down for the past several months since they've been out there, but they're doing a lot of crashing and banging today. Yes, it's very atmospheric and not stressful at all. I wanted to talk to you about a reissue of a documentary, which perhaps you saw the first time around. I noticed that it had been re-released at the cinema by the BFI, and that I was in London and none of the dates worked for me. And then by pure serendipitous chance, I happened to be in Manchester and at a loose end one afternoon a few weekends ago, and I went to see it at the cinema. It's called Dance Craze. And did you see it the first time around?
I think it was out in like 1980 or something, so I'm not sure I saw it when it was supposed to be, but I've definitely seen it. I saw it at some stage, and the two-tone revival thing and the tour, that the specials and madness. And
so it's basically it's filmed at several different venues, and it's just a lineup of ska and two-tone bands. I mean, there's some lowlights as well as highlights. Bad Manners, I kind of wish didn't exist.
I've got great Bad Manners trivia fact. You'll love this.
Oh, go on.
So Buster Blood Vessel. Like when he was like on his low ebb, and the band weren't touring anymore and all that sort of stuff, he was kind of needed a bit of money. He applied for a job in a Bad Manners tribute band. And they didn't give him the job because they said he wasn't fat enough.
That's amazing. Wow. Oh my God. That's just like heartbreaking for him on so many levels. Super. That's amazing.
But tell us about Dance Craze though. Sorry, I digress.
It's so brilliant. I mean, it just, you can listen to ska and music of that era. And I think I've said before, like, one of the first cassette albums I ever bought with my own money, if not the first, was like a Madness album. So that music means a lot to me. And as we've discussed before on this podcast, Madness really stand up as such a great band. The Specials too. But the way this documentary is filmed, they have camera people on the stage. And obviously you're seeing the bands, fucking hell, the Selector, amazing performance too. But also the crowd is captured as well. All the young people and the fashion. Like, so you feel really, really immersed in it. And the energy of the live performance is just captured really well. It's such there's a kind of weird interim bit in the middle where they sort of show a load of archive footage about people, like kids learning to ballroom dance, which might have been more relevant the first time around when that documentary first came out. But I just loved it. And immediately I just wanted to go out and buy a load of suits and only wear suits and slacks and maybe a little fedora hat, although I'm not sure how well I could pull that off.
Yeah, that film is brilliant. The energy of it all. I think it's it's a history thing really, because the time is really important there. It was like late 70s, early 80s, and it had just been a generation and a half maybe since the Windrush boats came over, and and all of this West Indian influence came into our cities, and it had all that horrible racial tension that was going on. And it was serious in those days. I can remember seeing proper skinheads and, with Nazi stuff going on and saluting and shouting stuff about the town. Like, I remember seeing that for real in my town and thinking, bloody hell, this is dark. Do you know what I mean? But then, and this is the important thing, this fresh generation of kids just went, screw that. Do you know what I mean? And they came together in this beautiful way. And I don't know if you know Coventry as a city, but it was a mess in the early 70s, and it managed to find an identity. And it's so proud that it became this epicenter of two-tone, And there was stuff going off in other parts of the city, especially London with Madness and all that sort of thing. But in those days before internets and all that sort of thing, this scene pops up here, and then they find out that Madness exists in Camden, and then they get together and do this incredible tour and go and see all these different parts of the country. And the music is so infectious, and the fashion is so cool, and the energy that is brought by all of those things coming together, it literally lasts. It lasts forever. It's still exciting to watch. And when you were talking about it, it must have been 10 years since I last saw it, but I was like, just little hairs going up on my arms, just thinking, yeah, God, that was great, that, wasn't it? And you're right about the cameras on the stage are really important in it, because so often you get what we try and do on this podcast is talk about music, but from a fan's point of view. We're not really talking, we're not just going to sit there and go, oh, lovely music, blah, 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 clever people. And we do a bit of that. But we also talk about what it means to be the person listening to it. And that is kind of our raison d'etre. And I think when you've got the cameras on the stage, you, see the crowd and how much it means to them and what they're doing and how they're trying to change their world by the way they move and the way they interact with each other. And you also see those bands, and they're so young.
Yes, oh my God, Terry Hall looks so like he's about 18 or something.
God, he's impossibly hot.
Yeah, yes, I know, beautiful, absolutely beautiful. So is Suggs, actually. They all are. Yeah, I fancied every single, what, with certain exceptions. I fancied pretty much everyone on that stage.
What, even Jerry Dammers and his toothless grin of scariness?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it depends what he's wearing, but yeah.
Oh, absolutely brilliant documentary. And I can see why that would have an effect on you.
Another thing that was really noticeable, both in the bands and in the crowds, was the fact that it was men and women playing this music, and it all seemed very equitable. They had what was the name of the band?
Pauline Black,
who's absolutely incredible and just owns the stage. Body Snatchers as well, all female group.
Heralded Dakar and all that stuff. Yeah, I mean, and also even at the later stages, you've got sort of even Bananarama and the Fun Boy 3 coming together sort of afterwards. I don't know. The whole thing was a time when there was a lot of breaking down of race. And there was a bit of breaking down of the sexes as well. And it was a really positive movement. Now, I've talked to Pauline Black and Jenny Bellstar, who was in that kind of era as well. And they both said, although that was true, it was hard. They were hanging around laddie lads. It was a difficult trip for them, but they did it. They broke that mould. And certainly, I think you have to take your hat off to all those brilliant, sharp women of that scene that just made so much great music.
Yeah.
And yeah, fabulous. The fashion was unbelievable. I could never get into that because I could never be that neat. And,
I mean, that's the thing. I'm allergic to ironing, so it might not last long.
Yeah, totally. And how do you dance in loafers? I don't think. I mean, I could do it in the Dockers maybe, but that's a bit clod heavy. I don't know.
So we need to study this documentary forensically and figure that out.
Well, I'd happily watch that again. Let's get some popcorn in. There are some bands that achieve success and then disappear from the national consciousness almost completely. And then there are some bands who never make a dent on the mainstream, and yet their influence grows over the years to elevate them higher than they ever would have been during their supposed heyday. ESG are one of these enigmatic bands that made music so startling that the world really wasn't ready for them at the time. But since their inception in the 80s, their reputation has grown to legendary status, and their influence can be felt today through bands like the Yeah Yeah Yeahs and countless hip-hop acts who have sampled their genius. So we should be really grateful to Cherie Percy for writing up the brilliant account of ESG's seminal underground classic, Come Away with ESG, on the ever-entertaining 33 1/3 book series. Welcome to What Goes Around, Cherie.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Well, it's a real pleasure to have you, and especially to have you on to talk about this great record that has had an enormous influence on the music scene, but still is one of those sort of overlooked classics that a lot of people might not know they know, but they might have heard samples of it or versions of it, or just felt the reverberations from this record, because it really is an underground classic. Can you tell us a little bit about who ESG were and where they come from?
Absolutely. So ESG were the Scroggins sisters. There was 4 of them in the original lineup. So that was Renee, Valerie, Deborah and Marie. And they kind of came to being they grew up in the South Bronx. They lived in the projects just by St. Mary's Park. And that area at the time was quite notorious for the crime that was going there. Our listener might reference the fact that the Bronx was burning. Like, that was a lot of the headline material at the time around that borough in New York. And so Helen Scroggins, their mother, gifted her daughters with instruments in a bid to kind of keep them safe and off the streets. A few of their other siblings had already kind of joined gangs and they were involved in drug use and stuff. So yeah, it's a beautiful story. And I think Renee, when I first interviewed her, I've interviewed her a couple of times now, spoke a lot about the fondness that the family would sit around and watch like Don Kirkner on the TV and proper talent shows, like the Jackson Family as well. And that's where the idea came from, really, for them to start to perform, initially performing covers of things like James Brown, she talked about. And then there's a lovely line from Renee where she says she was so into the bridge, the idea of James Brown taking it to the bridge, she just wanted to write a song that sounded like the bridge for the whole time. Which I think you can hear in their tracks.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, they really are an interesting prospect, because there is a very catchy pop edge to them, but they never quite caught on the mainstream, and yet everything they did seemed to chime right across the board on the underground dance scene, especially in New York. Why do you think their sound sort of worked itself so flawlessly right across the whole of the scene at the time?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and not just the scene, but as I say in the book, almost like 4 decades. Like, this record is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year, and in that time, I feel like there is ESG's sound sort of permeates multiple decades, and I try and touch on some of that in the book as well, about the fact that when they started in the early 80s in the South Bronx, this group of young black sisters are actually making a sound that's quite an anomaly to the rest of their peers who are creating hip hop and that whole scene coming out of the Bronx. So that flows on, and as you say, they may be a bit of an anomaly at the time in their scene against particularly other sort of new wave peppy bands like Blondie and Talking Heads in New York at the time. And then they go on to influence the 90s with a lot of hip hop artists sampling their stuff, as you mentioned, into the noughties with bands like the Yeah Yeah Yeahs. James Murphy from LCD Sound System has kind of heralded them up there as well. Even Latigra, Kathleen Hanna, references them as a bit of an influence as well. But never making the mainstream. And that's one of the points I make at the end of the book, actually, that now that people have picked this book up as part of the series, and I'm so honoured that it joins the ranks of 33 1/3, that now they're kind of let into this secret of ESG. And hopefully that gives them a bit more of a spotlight that they've deserved all along.
And there's a really curious link to England and Manchester and the whole Factory Records thing. Tell us a little bit about how that happened, because I don't know, but I've heard rumours that basically Martin Hannet was asked to record them in New York and literally had like 5 minutes spare on the end of another tape, and that's what made it back over to England. Can you tell us a little bit about the connection between Factory and ESG?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, and it kind of ties to your last question, because actually, even though they might have seemed like an anomaly in New York, they actually found quite a welcome home in North England, in Manchester's sort of post-punk scene. And yeah, there was a lot of cross proliferation, I guess. Like Tony Wilson of Factory Records was sending some of his bands, like A Certain Ratio, over to New York, who ended up sharing the bill with ESG at one of the venues in New York called Danceteria, which sadly isn't active anymore. But yeah, they notoriously opened. Tony Wilson flew them over to open the club night, the Hacienda club night, which I recently rewatched 24 Hour Party People, and sadly Steve Coogan doesn't reference that in the film.
No.
But they were there. They opened that night. No one knew who they were, and actually I did speak to Peter Hook for the book because I wanted to get some of his impressions of that time and hear more about the Hacienda. And he said, you know, it was mainly Tony just being absolutely in love with New York and wanting to bring over some of that sound to Manchester, but likewise I guess getting his artists over into the New York scene as well. So it was a distribution deal that they ended up doing, because ESG were on 99 Records, which was a kind of infamous Brooklyn label run by Ed Bowman, and they set up a distribution deal for the EP with Factory Records. So he was, they were I think they might have even been one of the first US acts to come out on Factory Records.
Yeah, they definitely were, yeah.
Yeah, and certainly like one of the first sort of black female bands to come out as well, for sure.
Possibly the last, I think.
The only, yes, that's right.
Unless we go all the way to Cleopatra, I don't know. Don't think they graced Factory, but yeah, same area. But it's a really interesting thing, the way that Martin Hannet's recordings as well, are very famously minimal and austere. And actually, their music had that quality anyway, even without him being involved.
That's right.
But it had that kind of the space that you require for really great dance music. So when you amplify it on a big system, there's air to be shifted about, and it makes the dance floor come alive. So they really had something that, as you say, was very much at an angle to everything else that was going on at the time. You touched a little bit about the influences they had. What do you think their main sort of legacy would be now? How would you characterise, if someone said, well, what did they do? How would you characterise their lasting success?
The thing that's really sad about it is that often it's easier, and a lot of the press has been around because it's quite a fractious band, and it's actually only Renee Scroggins, band leader now, who is one of the original members in the group, and they are still performing. They're heading over to the UK this summer as well. But so a lot of as is customary with the press, a lot of the UK press and the States press is often around the kind of family internal disputes of the band. Yeah. Whereas actually, I think, as we've said, the legacy sits with all of those other countless lightning rods in modern music who have taken ESG, people like James Murphy, people like Karen O, who's also in the book, talking about they actually performed with ESG in 2009 in New York, and they say, Karen talks about the Yeah just wouldn't have been the band that they are today without bands like ESG. But I think it takes those people to talk about them, to get that name out there again, because it is really under the surface. It's very much a cult band. And that's why I really hope being part of this series kind of illuminates them even further to a wider audience.
Well, I'm sure it will, because for those that don't know, this series of books, 33 and a Third, they are really exemplary. I mean, just they take one album or one particular incident at a time and just go through that album, tell you the backstory, give you some of the sort of wider context of why that music is important. And even if it's not music that you're particularly into or familiar with, it's always a really interesting read. And it must be lovely to actually get your name on that list of great books that have come out on that series.
It's absolutely wild. Yeah, I still can't quite believe it. I got some copies through in the post, and it's crazy to see it. I'm doing a couple of launch events around the book's release as well, so it'll just be such a novelty 3 years in the making to see people handling the book and hopefully enjoying the story as well, because I think that's the thing. As much as this series is based on the album, ESG have such a wider story, so I think readers will notice that I've gone quite deep into, as you say, the North England Manhattan connection there, the 99 record story, because that's fascinating in itself. There's a lot around ESG that I felt needed to be told.
Well, I'm really glad you are bringing it to the fore, because I think it's one of those records that, it will bring a lot of joy to a lot of people. And it is one of those things, as a DJ, I'm always kind of like shuffling around looking for something interesting to play. And, you know, sometimes people ask me, why do you do it? Why, you know, because you're obviously, I'm obviously not making money at it, but why do you keep doing it? And the reason is because of groups like ESG that you find occasionally, and you can just spread that love and pass that on to someone. And, you know, I can hear from your voice the enthusiasm you've got for this. And that's what that series does so well. I always liken the 33 to thirds to... there's like revision books you used to get for like
it's like a Cliff's Notes
type
thing.
Because you get all the important information in a nice handheld size. So I love that series, and I can't wait to get stuck into your book. Thank you so much for talking to us today about it, and best of luck with it.
Thank you so much, and I hope everyone enjoys both reading and listening to ESG, the might of ESG.
I'm sure they will.
Very pleased to welcome Paul Hanford to the podcast. He's written a beautiful book called Coming to Berlin, all about, well, Paul, it's about your relationship with Berlin, essentially, where you now live. Am I right?
Yeah, and also the relationship of other people as well. But what I did is I wrote it from the perspective of people that have also, like myself, come from other parts of the world, or maybe even just other parts of Germany, but certainly other parts of the world, and their experiences. Because as someone that's always enjoyed writing and talking about music, and myself moving to Berlin, there was this kind of natural instinct to think, I'd love to sort of explore this maybe as a book. But I also had like a massive sense of imposter syndrome that, you know, who am I, like this English guy, to write about someone else's culture when there's plenty of people in Berlin that grew up here that could be writing about it. But I kind of realized that it is a very international city, you know, and becoming an international myself, I found a lot of common ground with a very vast spectrum of culture and people from different places that have all at various points in their life come to the city for very similar reasons to the reason I had, really. So the book is basically about the lives of people who've discovered the city, really, through music.
How did you go about finding people who you thought would be interesting subjects for the book?
Well, I think because I'd been living in Berlin for 3 and a bit years before I started writing, so a lot of it just came out of the accumulation of lived experiences, really. So, for example, Mark Reeder, the chap Mark Reeder that appears in a couple of chapters, he's a very influential figure here, and he was one of the first Brits to move to Berlin in the late 70s, and at the time he was working for Factory Records. Well, he wasn't working for them, he was kind of like a cohort of Factory Records, and he brought Joy Division over for the first gig in the late 70s, and then he kind of got influenced into the whole techno culture as well when that happened 10 years later. He was already someone I kind of knew. I'd met him a couple of times and I'd bump into him in cafes, and he's just generally known as a local legend, really. And also just from being involved in music here and the culture around it, I kind of had 3 years of figuring out, without me even intending to know I was doing it, to know who would be brilliant to write about, really.
Yeah.
So when it came to writing, it was more like I couldn't wait to start on each chapter and go, brilliant, I'm going to write about this person next.
And it must have been so satisfying to know, because I'm sure, like, seeing these people around the city, it must be so tempting to want to sit them down and sort of ask them about their story and get into a sort of deep conversation with them. It must be nice to have that excuse.
Absolutely, definitely. And I think, you know, there's so much that has happened in Berlin that has been quite historical on a global scale. And a lot of the people I spoke with have lived through very, very turbulent times in European history, but living it through music. So it was so fascinating to be sat sometimes like in a cafe whilst people be talking to me about the experiences they had at a time where we'd be sat would be forbidden. You know, like I'd meet someone in East Berlin and we'd be having a coffee or having a stroll where maybe it was just along the side of the Berlin Wall or in a cafe that wouldn't have existed, where the idea of being able to have like an oat flat white would have, would have just been, just what? Alien. And that was only that was only 30 years, just over 30 years ago that stopped. So to put that in context, that was only 2 years after. I don't know why I thought of this example. It's a really random one. It's only 2 years after Terminator 2 came out.
But it's an interesting juxtaposition, because it's like something slightly whimsical with something incredibly serious. And like, can we wind back a little bit and talk about your past a little bit? Because one of the ways that I've seen you frame your relationship with Berlin is that you're one of the only people who came to Berlin to stop DJ. Can you give me a little bit of context for that?
Sure. Well, I'd become a DJ in London for maybe a decade before I moved to Berlin, and I think like a lot of people, I had these kind of grand ambitions to be like a really cool techno DJ like Daniel Avery or High or someone really amazing like that. But instead what I found was I would be doing, it was still a lot of fun, but I'd end up playing a lot of hotels and shops, like the Big Top Shop in Oxford Circus and things like that, and a lot of events, and a lot of it was very fun. But you end up sort of, you're playing more music on request, really, and so there was a point where I wasn't sick of playing. I'm trying to think of what you'd always get. You'd always get asked for Mr. Brightside.
Oh yeah, nothing changes.
Nothing changes, and you could just time it. You could kind of see the person walking from across the hotel lobby. They're going to ask for Mr. Brightside. I know it, and so that kind of became. I kind of realised I'd become very detached from my love of music, really, by playing Mr. Brightside.
So many of us have had the same experience around that exact same track.
It was very much like kind of coming to a city where everyone is a DJ, but I'm like, finito, that's it, I'm done.
Wow. So you weren't tempted to try and continue your DJ career after you moved to Berlin?
Well, I do, I've been playing a little bit in a couple of bars that I have a couple of residencies in, but it's very low key and it's
just a couple of residencies.
Yeah, just a couple. Don't but it's not really something I used to be able to pay my bills with. Where that'd be my main way of paying bills. Now it's more like for the love of it again, which is really nice. Like one place I play is called Dream Baby Dream, giving it a little plug, and it's got a little mention in the book as well, and it has amazing cocktails, and the music policy is just like cold wave industrial stuff like that. So there's no chance of Mr. Brightside unless Robin Gristle got back together and did a remix.
Oh, please let that happen. I hope so. I hope someone hears this and makes that happen. And I've been there once, a long time ago, and I didn't really experience that much of the nightlife. But the way that I've heard you describe it, you do make it sound like this incredibly sort of open-minded, hedonistic place. Is that accurate?
I think it can be, definitely, and I think there's an opportunity for it to be here. I think after the reunification, when the wall came down, it was very much the way the city came together was through. That happened at exactly the same time as rave culture sort of began developing, and acid house culture, and at the same time as the use of certain mind altering substances as party dancing devices, and this all happened at the same time as a lot of space became available in the city. Like people would leave East Berlin, like just pack up and leave, and so there'd be empty spaces where people put on parties, and so the whole idea of music and culture and free thinking existed here beforehand, like in the 1920s, the Weimar and stuff, and various other points, but it really galvanized and became, I guess, like what the city's known for and what the city holds close to its heart as a sort of a cultural church, I guess, after that. And so that sort of the belief systems around that about dance culture have kind of really embedded into the city. So it does provide, if that's what you want, the opportunity to live like that, or more like that, I'd say, than in other cities. But at the same time as that, we do have gentrification and we do have rising rents, and it's also a city of over 4 million people. So, you know, there's only a portion of people that live like this. There are many people that do that. You know, that's not their thing at all. You know, that
when you say the belief systems of that kind of music, how do you define that?
I guess it's like there's a sort of utopian idea about the dance floor, isn't there? Of like a free space, and whether or not that is actually always a reality, or more like an ideal that is embedded into the culture here. So it kind of extends in strange ways across the city, and you know, so you people will strip off in a park if they want to, you know, or like run naked into a lake, and it's not a problem, or you can still smoke in bars most of the time. And there's also like a kind of a resistance to more or less degree, although that is quite tense at the moment, against sort of neoliberal culture. So a lot of cafes don't accept cards, and so you do have to kind of get cash out a lot, which I actually think is quite nice, really. You know, I know it makes a lot of practical sense to have a card, you know, pay for everything on a card, but I think doing things that are sometimes like not out of convenience kind of puts us in, you know, to me anyway, puts me in contact with maybe more of the system around how things function and work, really. You know, we don't become blasé to, you know, like modern neoliberalism, really, although that does exist here. You know, there's loads and loads and loads of delivery services, and but you do have the opportunity to explore your freedom in that kind of way.
Yeah. One last question. If you were to build your perfect night out in Berlin, where would it start and end, and what would happen in between?
Oh my gosh, okay. I guess it would probably start with some really nice food with a small group of friends, like maybe just 2 other friends, you know. I think that's another thing about clubbing here, is it's really nice to go with a very small group of people, you know. It's not like a going out with 10 people, all of the lads kind of experience. You know, it's have like a very, very nice, very calm meal. Maybe go to a spa afterwards. We have a really good spa culture here, which particularly in the winter is just fantastic. You know, the coming out of a sauna and suddenly being hit by snow is just this kind of, it's like a sort of sweet and sour kind of hits the sweet spot kind of thing. And then a bar in a part of Berlin called Neukölln, which has a good variety of bars. Then maybe about 3 a.m, go to a club. I mean, I'm sure many of your listeners would have heard of Berghain, which is, you know, obviously Berlin's most famous one, but there's a lot of variety here of clubs. And then sometime late on Monday, kind of just wind down into a ball, really.
I love that. This is obviously the one of the privileges of freelance life as well. Monday is for just rolling up into a ball after a big weekend.
Oh, absolutely. And then just you know, have that moment where you kind of have a sudden horror and go, oh my God, have I got 3 Zoom meetings tomorrow? And then
back to life. Paul Hanford, thank you so much. Congratulations again on the book coming to Berlin.
Thank you so much, Deb. Thank you.
Pleasure speaking to you.
What we're gonna do right here is go back.
Way back into time.
That's right.
Name that tune. Name that tune.
Today's guest is both an Edinburgh Comedy Award-winning comedian and an ARIA Gold Award-winning broadcaster, a DJ, a writer and a TV regular. His weekly radio show with Ellis James has become a cult classic since launching in 2014, pivoting from XFM to BBC Radio 5 Live and picking up awards and accolades along the way. He hosts several podcasts ranging in subject matter from golf to Queen, to pubs, to mental health, and you've likely caught his warm, witty, eccentric stand-up comedy everywhere from Mock the Week to Live at the Apollo to Drunk History. Today, though, I'm very pleased to say that he is with us in his capacity of committed music nerd. John Robbins, welcome to What Goes Around.
Hey, thank you so much. That was a very kind introduction.
Oh, good. Was everything all... Usually there's one red herring in there somewhere that we don't realise. Was that all accurate?
I'd say sort of TV regular might be pushing it a bit.
Not according to your website, John.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, the sort of party line, because I have to sort of, I'm like an MP who's been hauled out in front of the press to sort of justify the fact I've said I'm a TV regular. So,
sure.
You know, we're just looking forward. We're not thinking about the past because we're a progressive comedian, and we want to regain the central ground, and that's what people want. Next question.
We're not going to get a straight answer out of this guy.
No, exactly. But speaking of being progressive, you're off on tour very soon, and I'm curious because the last time I spoke to you, we had a conversation about comedians and the music that they pick for the interval of their show or for when the audience are kind of arriving before they go on stage. We talked about a lot of different comedians picking jazz. I know Stuart Lee likes a bit of Coltrane. When I saw Dylan Moran, he had Chico Hamilton. And I'm curious if you have been pedantic about kind of deciding what music you're going to have in those points in the show.
Yeah, and there's sort of two strings to that bow, really. I mean, one, you need music that gets people slightly energetic but doesn't sort of bang them over the head. It's more the volume of it. It has to be loud enough so that people raise their voices when they're sitting down, but not so loud that they can't speak.
So you have been pedantic about it. So
well, yeah.
from this.
and right in the fader.
Yeah.
Quite often at venues, I will say to like the sound tech, I'll say, can you just bring it down a notch or bring it up a notch? And then you can feel that buzz in the room start to go. And I've made mistakes in the past, especially when I was starting out in Edinburgh, of just picking songs I wanted people to hear as if to go, I'm really cool. This is the sort of music I listen to. So if you like this music, you'll like me. Well, that just alienates the 99% of the audience who don't like that sort of music. Recently, I think when I did Darkness of Robins, that was a lot of car seat headrest because that was sort of, it was like angry and energetic without being sort of like playing metal to people. And then this last time around, I've been playing a lot of Ezra Furman, which has just got, I think that's like perfect walk-in music.
Yeah, that's quite jaunty, isn't it, in its own little way? Yeah,
jaunty, but it's like got real bite to it in places, especially the more recent stuff. But also, when I start to think about what the show will be about, thinking about what music I want to walk on and walk off to does play a part in that, a bit like coming up with the title of the show and creating like a mood and an atmosphere in the room. So I do enjoy that bit because there's very little pressure. It's not like writing an hour and a half of stand-up. It's just thinking, what great song do I want to hear when I say goodnight?
We had Marcus Brigstock on, who one of his choices was The Cure. He was very, very into The Cure, especially when he was younger. And he said that for the last sort of 10, 15 years, he had been trying and thinking about and daring himself to use Plain Song by The Cure as his intro music. But he loved them so much, he felt he'd only let them down. Which I thought was lovely. You know, like just like, I want to play it, but I won't live up to it. I'll be overdone by my own theme music.
Well, I already, even though I haven't written the second half of my tour yet, tickets are available. I already know the song I'm going to walk off to, and I know at what point in the song it's going to kick in, and that's like the foundation upon which I'll build everything else.
I like that. By the way, if you hear a tiny crew of gnomes tapping away, I think Deb has decided to broadcast from a building site.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
Might be a little bit of tap, tap, tap.
Can you hear that intense?
I can hear that quite well now.
Really? Oh, for God's sake. One of your podcasts, John, I don't think I even realised this, that you're such a huge Queen fan, so much so that you've got an entire podcast about Queen. And yet, out of your phonographic memories, you haven't picked a Queen track. What is, can you give a bit of context to this love of Queen? Is it the music? Is it the spectacle? The phenomenon of Queen? What is it?
Well, I think sort of Queen, above all other music, just when I first heard it, when I would have been about 9 or 10, it just felt like it was already inside me. It just felt like the melody chimed so much with just something in my DNA that it wasn't really a matter of this. To say it's my favourite wouldn't quite be right. It's just I honestly can't describe it. It's more than, so I wouldn't necessarily say my favourite track was a Queen track or my favourite album was a Queen album. In fact, I wouldn't. It goes somewhere deeper than that. I first sort of became aware of them when Freddie died, because it was all in the news. I sort of began to piece together that my mum had played bits and bobs of Queen when I was growing up. But it's at that point where you don't really you don't necessarily know the difference between the different bands or what you hear, because you're never actively listening to music. I just, for about 7 years, was completely and utterly obsessed with Queen. And really, my journey in music has been sort of from starts the minute I started listening to stuff other than Queen, I guess. But it did instill in me a love of melody.
Yeah.
And a love of sort of orchestration that flows through a lot of things I like.
Yeah. And do you still return to Queen, or do you feel like you've just kind of ingested that and it was kind of a pivot point to get you into other stuff, or do you still listen to it with that kind of warm, nostalgic feeling?
Well, weirdly, I guess when Ellis and I started doing the radio show in 2014, I had all this knowledge of Queen, but it was sort of on the back burner, really. But then he started to sort of tease me about the fact I was in the Queen fan club, and he thought it was a lame band to be into, and the fact that I got into Queen when everyone else was into Blur and Oasis. So I was this sort of lone voice crying in the wilderness in sort of 1995, trying to convince girls at school that Queen were really cool, and I decorated all of my folders with Queen stuff while everyone else was doing like football and Oasis. So it's quite a funny idea going through the 90s with a Queen lens, which was the decade of which they had, I mean, literally nothing going on.
Yeah.
So the Queen fan club magazines from when I joined are hilarious, because there's just like the release of a PC game and that's about it.
Wow, a PC game.
What was the game? Now I'm in.
Yeah.
It's called Queen the Eye, and there's an interview with Brian May that's really badly transcribed where he's talking about how much he loves Doom. And so there was sort of an amusing side to it. But I sort of got back into Queen retrospectively when Ellis introduced this sort of the character of me as the Queen fan. And then people started sending me loads of Queen stuff, some of it quite rare, because I was a collector of Queen memorabilia. I mean, if I went to a desert island, I probably wouldn't pick Queen, because it's just all in my head.
Sure, yeah.
I could sit down and play a Queen album in my head, so it would feel a waste of a choice.
Whenever I think about the going away to the desert island thing, there's a few things that ponder in me. And one of those things is that, do I need that? Because that's already in my head. And I always want Lady Day and John Coltrane by Gil Scott-Heron. But then if I had that, then I'd want to play Lady Day and John Coltrane straight afterwards. And then that's three of my choices gone, and I've completely screwed Desert Island Discs.
Yeah, that's good. That's a tactical move. I'm just thinking my ex's mum was completely obsessed with Queen, and one time we were after she died, we were going through her stuff and found this embroidery she had done of Freddie Mercury. It was the most gorgeous thing.
Oh, lovely. Send it to John.
I know. Well, it's too late now. We've broken up. I think I've lost access, unfortunately. Yeah, sorry about that. Shall we get into your phonographic memories then, and your first choice, which is a track by Godspeed You Black Emperor called Moya. What can you tell us about this one?
this was the first time, apart from Pulp, who I was into Pulp at the time, and Pulp were the first band I was into when they were releasing music. But I remember in sixth form, I bought a copy of The NME. I probably only bought The NME 5 times, and each time something magical happened. And I think it was the New Year issue of NME in 1999 had a CD on the front called Annual Probe Volume 2. It had a lot of musicians on that I'd not heard of, who all became sort of part of my late teens. So there's Mercury Rev and Arab Strap, Third Eye Foundation, Boards of Canada, Jurassic 5, and the first volume had Elliott Smith on. And the last track on that was called Dead Flag Blues. Oh. And I remember listening to it in the sixth form common room, and just probably for the first time in my life hearing a type of music that I had never heard before. And it's quite hard really to hear stuff that you can't put in some kind of context, or you can't think, oh, that's a bit like that other thing I like, oh, I'll probably like this. Whereas listening to this, it was like, well, this is completely new. And I bought the EP Slow Riot for New Zero Canada, and that had 2 tracks on it, Moya and Blaze Bailey Finnegan III. And I put Moya on in my bedroom with my headphones on, and it's one of the very few times I would say my life changed immediately by listening to a song. I had never heard anything like it. And also, it was sort of tied up in a lot of other stuff. So my dad moved to Canada when I was 7, and he lived in Montreal, and that's where Godspeed are from, and obviously it's got Canada in the title. Had this mysterious writing on the front, which is a biblical quote in the Hebrew. And my dad's a very religious guy, and that was sort of part of the reason he left. And it just felt quite I can't. The word magical isn't quite right. It felt there was something mystical about it. But also that song. I mean, it's so intense, and yet the melody is extraordinary. And I went to see them at the Fleece in Bristol. And to see it live, where they've got like a cellist, a couple of violinists, 2 guitarists, 2 bassists, a drummer, and they were playing this projection of a guy flipping his keys. And I swear to God, I thought that guy was my dad. It was this guy with a big beard, a big sort of uncool overcoat on. And I thought maybe that was filmed in Canada. Maybe that's my dad. Of course it's not my dad, but something about that. And then one of the amps exploded, and these sparks just burst out of this amp, the bass amp. And I went home and I just couldn't sleep. The sound of violins ringing in my ears. And also, I was 17.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's prime time, isn't it?
it's the sort of age when you don't get those experiences with music as much later in life.
No, it's true. There's something about discovering stuff like that in your teenage years that feels so serendipitous, as if it's found you. It's such a magical thing. I wonder, like, you mentioned feeling slightly alienated from your peers around that time because you were so into Queen and everyone else was into Britpop. Did you get your friends into Godspeed around that time as well, or was this sort of something that was just for you?
No, it was. There was a group of us. I hung out a lot with the kids in the year above, and there was sort of this. I remember sixth form. I didn't really have much of a set of friends at secondary school, and then sixth form I discovered. Through discovering this sort of music, I made friends with probably about eight or nine people in the year above. A few of them were goths. I shaved my head and got a Mohican. I had painted nails. I had a studded dog collar, a velvet jacket.
Oh, yeah.
Good man.
And it was almost like overnight. I was like, okay, I feel like I'm somewhere where I fit. And I found people who are interested in the things I'm interested in, who talk about the things I want to talk about, who aren't sort of going to take the piss out of my clothes, who are accepting of difference. Who aren't constantly obsessed with whether you're gay or not. That was like the thing at school. It's weird now because that's sort of, I hope, not as much a part of growing up, but it was all like, you're gay.
Yeah.
Well, what?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
It was just the go-to thing.
Yeah.
Totally.
Especially if you had gothic tendencies.
Yeah.
You know, I was all eyeliner and nail varnish myself, and it was pretty much like the opening offer of communication from quite a lot of people at school.
I remember on a non-uniform day I wore a tie-dyed Metallica, just long-sleeve T-shirt that you would look back on now as like quite a 90s bit of clothing, and I wore this studded dog collar, and like my year went ballistic. It was like I'd come in naked. It was so. I remember this girl coming up to me and saying, "Are you a raver or a jitter or what?" And I didn't know what the answer was, because I didn't know what those phrases meant. Anyway, so I sort of found my tribe, and we listened to Godspeed and Mogwai. I remember hearing Young Team for the first time, and just, oh man, it was like my brain exploded, and I never had that feeling with music before.
Yeah.
And then, so through that you get into stuff like Sigur Rós and A Silver Mount Zion. Going to gigs. I saw Godspeed and Sigur Rós at the Trinity Centre in Bristol. And I saw Mogwai at, where would it have been? The Academy. And
these are properly deep choices, aren't they?
Yeah, very sophisticated.
This isn't like 17, 18.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people try and find something that kind of separates them out and helps them find their crowd or whatever. But I would say most of the time it's something immediate, and kind of and perhaps that you could sing along with, or you could at least pogo around to. But you can't have like a thumbnail visit to Godspeed You Back Emperor. You can't say, well, I'll give it 2 minutes. You know that thing when Nile Rodgers says, like, don't bore us, hit us with the chorus. Well, Godspeed don't even kick in until like 12 minutes into the track. So, I mean, you sound like a very deep, thoughtful kind of kid, really.
Well, I think it's like the music matches the intensity of your emotion at the time. And I was, constantly falling in love with girls. I wrote a lot of very, very bad poetry. I was that kind of kid, very sort of isolated at home in my bedroom, reading a lot of poetry, writing a lot, writing journals and letters to myself, all that kind of crap. And it was finally like, I could hear what I was feeling in a way. And people were also, it's not a million miles away from like Nirvana if you think about some of the riffs, because there are riffs in Godspeed and there are big riffs in Mogwai. So there is that sort of way you can hook it into rock. But it did feel like something totally different. And by the time that sort of second wave of post-rock, or maybe third wave, because I don't know much, I was never into My Bloody Valentine or the really early post-rock stuff, though I really like Sonic Youth. But by the time stuff like Explosions in the Sky came around, I was sort of, I didn't grasp onto those newer bands as much.
But then, I'm presuming this is chronological. Was it at that point that you started getting into Frank Zappa? Because the live version of Joe's Garage or Garage, as he'd probably say, is your next choice.
Yeah, it would have been around the same time. And I remember I was sort of, one of my first progressions from Queen was Lou Reed solo stuff. And I was listening to an album called Rock and Roll Animal, which is this very proggy, big guitar solo-y. It was his big return after Transformer, and he had this bleach blonde hair. He had sort of aviators. He looked I just wanted to look like him so much. He had like tight T-shirts. I think remains the coolest looking musician ever. Sort of early 70s Lou Reed. I was playing one of these big guitar solos to my friend, and he said, "Oh, if you like that, you'll like Frank Zappa." And I had heard about Frank Zappa, but the only thing I'd heard was this rumour, which is the first thing he addresses in his book, which is that he says to someone at a live gig, "Oh, what's the most outrageous thing you do?" And they take a shit on stage, and then Zappa eats it. And it's completely untrue. And I don't know where it came from, but that was my fact I knew about him. So I thought he was some kind of gross sort of goth, like almost Alice Cooper type, even though there's a big connection between Zappa and Alice Cooper, because he was the first person to release Alice Cooper's stuff. And anyway, this guy, my friend Joe, he put on a song. I can't remember what it was, but it was just a guitar solo. And again, it was the other time in my life where I heard something that I'd just never heard the like of before. And it was so extraordinary to hear a sort of 8-minute guitar solo that was musically very complex and intriguing and confusing, but also just catchy as hell. So I went to Imperial Records in Bristol, and I remember all of the sort of back catalogue CDs were $5.99. And I went to the Frank Zappa section, and it was there were probably about 30 CDs. Yeah. And so all the people always say to me when I talk about Frank Zappa, they're like, "Oh, how do I get into it? What should I start with?" I just bought the CDs with the covers I liked. And I bought the first one I bought absolutely free, and I bought Cheap Thrills, this compilation. And Cheap Thrills is where I first heard Joe's Garage live. And it's not like, it's not my favourite Frank Zappa song, but it just represents for me that door opening to a world of music that you can't really describe, because every time I try to describe Frank Zappa, it makes him sound awful.
Just enough room to cram the drums in a corner over by the bar. She was a 54 with a mashed up door and a cheesy little lamp, with a sign on the front said Fender Champ and a second-hand guitar. It was a Americana with a whammy bar. Back to you, Bill. We could jam at Joe's Garage. His mom was screaming, his function man, we was playing the same old song. In the afternoon, sometimes we would play all night long. It was all we knew and easy too, so we wouldn't get it wrong, even if we played it on a saxophone.
He's got an incredible range on him. Like he can do 8-minute searing guitar solos, but he also does like cheeky little 2-minute doo-wop songs and completely non-sense making skits and stuff. I mean, a lot of it's almost theatre as well. It's almost like musical stuff. Do you know what I mean? So there's a lot of Zappa to get into. I mean, how far did you go? Are you the full canon, or have you just picked your favourites?
I bought every Frank Zappa album, so I think I've got in the region. I haven't caught up as much with the sort of since streaming and stuff, because they're quite expensive, because they all come out in these sort of ridiculous box sets. But I think I've got about 90 Frank Zappa albums.
Wow.
I've got all the ones that were released up until about 2005.
Hats off to that. That's dedication. That's
I don't know.
A lot of Zappa.
Well, people have either got no Frank Zappa, they've got Hot Rats, or they've got everything he did.
Yeah,
I'm a Hot Rats guy.
I was just going to say, that's kind of amazing, because, you know, I consider myself to be a Frank Zappa fan, but I think it's almost impossible to enjoy everything he did. Like, I would imagine that Frank Zappa looks over his back cat, because, I don't know, the thing with Zappa, I always think, is that, like, he had to be constantly making music, and I would imagine that he looked back on some of his own back catalogue and wasn't necessarily too enamoured with it. It was more just like the process of making it was what kept him going. So there must be some in your 90 odd collection that you are not too fond of, or you consider to be a bit of, like, did you just kind of listen to it out of curiosity, or do you genuinely love it all?
Well, I'm glad all of it exists.
Sure, yes, diplomatic answer.
I wouldn't put on, for example, Lumpy Gravy and listen to it all the way through, because it's kind of the stuff of his I'm not as big a fan of is the sort of music concrete. Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Music concrete, which is the more like really out there discordant stuff. But I would say, I mean, over half of what he does is instrumental anyway. The stuff with lyrics you can kind of split into satire, songs about sex, and songs about music, really. The main reason people don't like him, I think, is because he is sort of 99.99% cynical, and people don't like the sneer of him. But, I mean, where else can you go in music for that? I mean, I recently got quite into Half Man, Half Biscuit, and they're quite sneery, and they're quite cynical, but there's a sort of a joy in it, because they're talking about very British stuff that you know. And I think the music, the popular music in the 60s and 70s, which, you know, probably broadly the same now, is a load of guys pretending they're romantic in order to have sex with women. And
that's the basis of all rock and roll, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think Zappa cuts through that hypocrisy so brilliantly.
Yeah.
And I don't think music critics liked him because he was ahead of them, and they like to be the ones telling you what's cool and what's not. Whereas for him to sort of say, at the time, hippie culture is a lie, and it's a commercial enterprise as much as anything else, I think is really brave and interesting. And also his sort of anti-drugs message was so effective on me, because I'd had people come into our school and do talks about how drugs were illegal and drugs were dangerous, but no one had ever said drugs are boring and people who take drugs are lame. And that's a much more effective message to a teenager, to go, this is dull.
Yeah.
If you take coke, you will be the most boring person in the room.
So you're into this like at a young age too. Then this was like a formative thing for you. This wasn't like I'm a confident music buyer now, and I'm gonna,
No, I think I'd have probably. I'd have been 16 when I first heard Zappa,
that's young, man.
And the vast majority of what I like about him is these very, very complex songs that sound like sort of kids' TV themes. So it's a bit like if John McLaughlin was writing a sort of sitcom theme tune. It made me laugh. Is the main reason I picked Joe's Garage. Is it made me laugh the first time I listened to it, and all the musicians are laughing. I'd never heard music that was designed to make people laugh before.
Yeah. Well, he did that whole album. Does humour belong in music? So I think it was a quite a lifelong question for him. That wasn't it?
Yeah, and sometimes it's just the titles of the songs are funny. and the rest of the songs are just sort of joyous. But I think there is a, if you were to listen to Roxy and Elsewhere, which is probably my favourite Zappa album, and in my opinion is the most talented group of musicians ever assembled, playing the most difficult music, but it's not difficult in an intellectual way. It's not like listening to sort of modern classical music. It's joyous rock music. But some of the songs, like one of them's called Don't You Ever Wash That Thing. That's an instrumental song. He had an album entirely composed on the synclavier called Jazz from Hell, which got a parental advisory sticker because one of the songs is called G-Spot Tornado.
I went to see, this is the thing as well, even the classical music that he made has so much humour in it. I actually went to see Yellow Shark being performed. I think it was like the BBC Youth Orchestra or something like that. And even like before the musicians came on stage, it's like this big classical setup, but there's a fucking banjo there and like all of these other weird instruments. And it was supposed to be like there was sort of a Zappa expert sort of giving a commentary and talking about how, a lot of the music is supposed to be a commentary on modern suburbia, and that's exactly what it is. And it is kind of cynical and it is kind of critiquing it, but there's so much humor and joy in it as well. I can't say my collection is as extensive as yours, but I'm a huge fan.
Yeah. It must have been nice as well, though, because one of the things, especially when you're young and you find an artist you like, is finding out what they think about stuff. You kind of touched on that a little bit, but the great thing about Zappa is, like, man, he had opinions on everything, and even if you don't agree with what he's saying, it's always fascinating to listen to him talk. He was a real. He a real great communicator and a real great thinker. And as you say, he enjoyed being a proper punk, a yippie, I guess he would class himself as. Someone who liked to kind of press the buttons of society, and even his own fans, he would try and wind them up a little bit. Do you know what I mean? And you must have had all this stuff to read as well that comes along with it.
Yeah, and I often think probably of every musician who died young, Frank Zappa is the one I most wish had lived to a ripe old age.
Yeah.
Because to have heard his take on the internet, on Trump, on culture wars, on absolutely everything, and I'm probably sure I wouldn't have agreed with him on everything, because he was obsessed with democracy, and he used to take voter registration booths to gigs. But he was not telling people who to vote for. He was just saying, if you haven't got skin in the game, you can't complain about stuff if you don't vote. And even if both options are awful, and even if you spoil your ballot or whatever, I think he would have eviscerated Trump. But he was kind of a libertarian, I think.
Yeah.
And he was pivotal in anti-censorship laws. But I would like to know the more current debate about free speech, which I don't actually think is a debate about free speech. It's a debate about people being assholes, because most people who shout loudest about free speech now are the ones who get most offended by what other people say. And I think, Frank Zappa's take on, for example, who's this complete twerp who's just been arrested?
Andrew Tate.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That sort of person, I think Zappa would have just destroyed them.
Yeah. What, didn't Zappa have an intention to go into politics, like around the time when he got sick? Am I imagining that? I feel like he was that was potentially...
There is a Zappa for President T-shirt that you've been able to get since the 70s. I think he was considering running for president in the way that, some people do
Dizzy
as a sort of
Gillespie
protest.
Yeah.
But he testified at the Senate or the House of Representatives or something because Tipper Gore...
Yeah.
Yes, the PMRC thing.
Yeah.
The PMRC thing, yeah. So the right to have references to masturbation and things in songs.
Absolutely.
And some of his comebacks to questions he's asked are absolutely incredible. But then I'm not sure. Would he have survived, to use a phrase that's perhaps more complex than people make out, but cancel culture? Because his daughter, I remember, said, my parents brought me a diaphragm when I was 13.
Yeah.
And is that, and she was sort of saying that wasn't a wholly positive experience.
Yeah. And he's famous for his treatment of women, and his wife I think is long suffering and stuff like that. Yeah, he probably I'm not sure if he would have been ripped to shreds, quite possibly.
I mean, he also was cruel to his children because he called them Dweezil and Moon Unit.
I think it's hard to. There are some songs that, though I would have played them with glee in the college bar 20 years ago, there are some songs, especially songs about gay people and women, that are hard to really stick up for now. As some of them, I mean, the only thing I would say is he had a sort of equal opportunities policy to his ire. So he would call out hypocrisy regardless of your race, ethnicity or gender, but that's probably as far as I would go defending some of his more problematic songs, let's say.
Yeah.
I'm sure he'd be absolutely cancelled every 10 minutes, but then, because he's so divisive and so inventive, and, there are some people who you can't really settle and agree with everything, but you just like to hear them talk. And I think he's one of those that would always, bubble back up to the surface. I don't think you can't iron Frank Zappa and his sort of personality out of music. You can't iron it out because, he did so much, and as you say, everything was a target for him. And so you could find something and say, I'm going to pin that on you. But then he was so wriggly, there would be 10 other things you could point to which say, well, yeah, but look at it this way. Do you know what I mean? He was always controversial in a true sense, and also in the music. Like look at the musicians he actually sort of brought through. People like Adrian Belew and that. He was looking for people that did things the wrong way. And he wanted to confound expectations every time he put a note down.
There's a really good documentary about the history of the Mothers with interviews of people from various incarnations of the Mothers of Invention, and they all speak about how brutal it was, the rehearsal process, the performance process. But every single one of them, when they're talking about the time they got the phone call to say their time in the band was up and he'd moved on to something else, they all look so bereft, even 40 years hence. And for fans of insanely deep cuts, I've got a DVD called The Drummers of Frank Zappa, which is a roundtable discussion with 4 or 5 of his drummers. And it's Terry Bozzio, Chad Wackerman, Chester Thompson and Ruth Underwood, and it's just such a great nerd out on because he started as a drummer, and his drum his sort of the drum music he writes is insane. The hardest ever drum piece is a Frank Zappa song called The Black Page, and it's used in there are videos on YouTube of graduates from the Royal College of Music playing it as like their final piece to be marked on. And it's called The Black Page because when he handed it to Terry Bozzio, there was so much ink on the on the music notation that's why it got its name.
Wow, I mean that's one of the marks of him as well. It's like he was old school in the fact that he did write this stuff down, and it wasn't like let's jam out a song. It's like, here is the carefully prepared manuscript. Do not deviate. Anyone out of time will be fined $50.
If you like Hot Rats, they've just released the Hot Rat Sessions.
Oh yeah,
which I think is the best recorded music I've ever heard. And you can hear the development of those tracks, and some of them are just like half-hour, 40-minute jams that could be released as finished songs. They're insane, but the instructions he's giving the musicians feel like you can almost hear the terror in the silence after he said, could you be a little brighter with your left hand? And you can hear the musician go, what the fuck does he mean?
Even though I could not get halfway through your Frank Zappa collection if I tried, I admire everything I've ever heard by him, because you can tell the precision and the thought that goes into every single piece. So even though it might not be that palatable for me, hats off, because I don't know anyone else who could do it.
Oh, well, it's been an absolute joy to discover him. I mean, when you get into an artist and you're like, oh, what album shall I get? And someone says, oh, there's a 90. I love that. I'm not someone who has a super broad taste, but the stuff I do like, I drill down into so deep that to have that much stuff to discover. I haven't even listened to every song that he's put out. But just go through the 70s chronologically and you'll...
Yeah, I think that's the best idea. Now, listen, Frank Zappa and Godspeed are both kind of epic, quite difficult bits of music, quite involved. I would say you're a deep motherfucker if I had to put a label on you now after listening to those. Nico Case, Star Witness is your third choice. And this is a much more kind of, I would say, traditional song. I'd not heard it before, and I thought it was very pleasant. Tell us a little bit about how you got to this particular track.
So this is sort of just a couple of years later than sort of my Zappa and Godspeed revelations, but I was getting into... I think I watched one of those documentaries about the 60s that used to get on the BBC, and it'd be like a 2-hour-long thing about the Byrds and the Eagles, and I really got into that post Summer of Love return to like American grassroots country music, the pivotal to which was the band. So I got really into the band, and then I think in 2000 or 2001 I picked up my best friend from his house in my Mini, and he put on the album I See a Darkness by Bonnie Prince Billy.
Oh, beauty. And
there began a now 23-year love affair with Will Oldham and what I guess you would call in a very broad sense Americana. So through Will Oldham I found, I mean, it's the seed that has makes up most of the music I listen to today, and I've seen Will Oldham I think 18 times. Cool. And I saw him a couple of weeks ago in London. So that will be 22 years after I first saw him live. So through him I discovered people like Wilco and Jim O'Rourke and then Nico Case. And for some reason, and I'll do my best to avoid this, whenever I talk about Nico Case, I get quite emotional because there's something about her, the power and fragility of her songs, which have been so important to me throughout so many years. And her first album, Blacklisted, I would have got when it came out, and that was, I think, 2002, 2003. And then Fox Confessor Brings the Flood, great album title, by the way. Came out in 2006, and I just moved out of home. I was living in Bristol with my friends. And those two albums, they just knocked me clean out. Even now, even talking about it 20 years later, I find it hard to talk about it without my voice going. And Star Witness, which is the song I picked, I don't know, she doesn't... Sometimes her lyrics, what I really like in a sort of folk lyricist, I guess, is to hear a line and think, what does that mean? I don't know what that means. And to sort of sit with it. I was getting into Astral Weeks at about the same time, which is probably my Desert Island disc album.
It's a beauty.
But to have these songs that you can't quite... There's something about them... You totally get it without quite knowing what it means, but it speaks to you. And every single album she's put out, and she's not the most prolific musician, has just been so on the money for me.
a Falcon sedan, 1969. The paper said 75. There were no survivors, none found alive. Trees break the sidewalk, and the sidewalk skins my knees. There's glass in my thermos and blood on my jeans. Nickels and dimes of the 4th of July roll off in a crooked line to the chain link lots where the red tails die. Oh, how I forgot what it's like.
There's this video on YouTube of two girls. I can't even describe the video without crying. Just singing this song in a stairwell to raise money, I think, for their sort of music group or whatever. And one of them's on a ukulele and the other one's just sat there. Oh man, I can't get through it. And someone tweeted Nico Case with the video, and she just replied with like 50 crying. You know the crying emoji where it's a straight line of tears.
The real deep I'm upset, I'm done for crying.
But sort of, you know, I'll never know what it would be like to listen to her music as a young girl. But to have a voice of such sort of power, but also, you know, moments of quite intense femininity. But her box set's called, I think it's called Truck Driver Gladiator Mule. I love that. Yeah, there's a great line from a song in a recent album, which is, I fucked every man that I wanted to be. I love that line.
Yeah.
I think that's incredible.
Yeah.
And she just can't put a foot wrong for me.
I've never heard of her before, and I'm definitely going to go and search this out now, because I think I'm sure Deb would agree. One of the reasons we like to do this podcast is because there's something like really beautiful about when someone really loves something and getting them to talk about it. Like, I mean, you're kind of apologising for bringing the emotion up in your voice and all that sort of thing, but that really is a wonderful thing, and it's one of the few areas where you can kind of when you talk about music and you talk about music you really love, it's one of the few areas where you can actually reveal a bit of yourself and say quite a lot about yourself without talking about yourself, if you know what I mean. It's like if you feel that strongly about a piece of music that even 20 years later it brings a lump to your throat, then you must have put so much into it. You must have put so much love into that whole piece of art. Yeah, I felt a great sense of loss when Apple stopped making iTunes because it had all my play counts on it. So I preserved them. I'll never forgive Apple for doing that, because iTunes was such a perfect way for me to interact with music. But my most listened to song of all time, thank God this doesn't include Queen when I was a kid, or it'd be embarrassing, but is a song called The Pharaohs, from Nico Case's album Middle Cyclone. And I have listened to that song 235 times, which doesn't sound like a lot, I guess, but that was probably, most of those listens were in the space of the first year or two that I had it. I think, she sort of emotionally, I think, means more to me than anyone, probably apart from Bonnie Prince Billy.
I find I sort of grew up being really touched by that sort of alt Americana type stuff as well. I always loved Bonnie Prince Billy and the band actually as well. I mean, I know it was later on, but I remember seeing The Last Waltz. I think my dad taped it off the TV when I was like 12, and I watched it and I watched it and I watched it, and then I dragged all my friends home from school and I was like, oh my God, look at this. There's something very authentic about it, and you put it so beautifully when you talk about when the words are just kind of slightly out of your out of your reach of understanding, but you kind of get them anyway. You feel understood by the artists. I completely relate to that, and I found that a lot listening to Bonnie Prince Billy growing up as well. Same kind of thing. But I feel like I read recently that Nico Case lives. Didn't she like semi-retire from music, and she lives on a farm now? Am I making that up?
I don't think she retired. I think she had a case of writer's block, and then her studio burnt down.
Oh shit!
No.
So she had a sort of enforced break, I think.
Okay.
I think she's touring because she's in the New Pornographers as well, and she's touring with the New Pornographers at the minute. And I saw her last at the Union Chapel, probably about 4 years ago, and I saw her warm-up show in the Lexington.
Yeah.
For that, which there were only about 120 people there, which was amazing, even though a guy ruined it by doing terrible farts right in front of me.
No! All the gigs to do that at.
I was just imagining, I think, because I love the Union Chapel, it's such a beautiful place to hear someone play. And I was thinking about that, these nice, quiet, shared moments. And now the thought of that guy just letting one go in front of you, that's bad.
It wasn't one, it was in the hundreds, and people started talking about it so much that he left.
Okay.
It was quite extraordinary.
We've got a long-standing problem with people talking during gigs, but if they're talking because someone's farting so much that it's actually conversation worthy, I think we've reached a new level.
Yeah.
It's outrageous.
The song that I've picked, Star Witness, just as an example of those lyrics, it begins... my true love drowned in a dirty old pan of oil that had run from the block of a Falcon sedan 1969. The paper said 75. Why say that they got the year of the car wrong in the newspaper? It's such a fantastic detail. There's something so authentic about that. That's like what you would... It's a weird detail you'd get in a novel.
Yeah, it's very literary.
And then trees break the sidewalk and the sidewalk skins my knee. There's glass in my thermos and blood on my jeans. Nickels and dimes of the 4th of July growing off in a crooked line to the chain link lots where the red tails dive. Oh, how I'd forgot what it's like. Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
But I don't know why that's amazing. But
I'm going to get on the whole discography of this woman. She sounds brilliant.
It's such a perfect poetic image. The trees breaking the sidewalk. Everyone knows what that's like when the roots of a tree push up the tarmac.
Yeah.
And then falling over and she's dropped her thermos. That's a superb poetic verse because you're making so many of the connections in your head.
Yeah.
Oh, man. I love her to bits.
Yeah.
If I met her, I think I'd explode or burst into flames or something.
That is always an interesting question, like whether you meet your heroes or not. And I am a bit like you. I would melt and become a bit of a useless fording tool if I was to meet some of my heroes. But you did get to interview Queen, did you not?
Well, I've been very, very lucky. I signed for an agent about 10 years ago who I'm no longer with, but they still do my tours. And they also do Queen's live stuff. And so I've met Brian May 4 or 5 times, interviewed him 3 or 4 times, interviewed him in person once. And I think that did teach me that when you do meet someone who you really, really admire, don't try to communicate more than that you do. Don't try and get into why, because it's impossible. It also puts up a big barrier between you because, and I know this from, on a much, much smaller scale from people who, like my stand-up, there's a sort of tension. It's like I'm embarrassed by compliments. I don't take compliments very well. So, but it's really nice when someone says, I love your podcast, or, that your stand-up show meant a lot to me. That's great. But when someone is trying and failing to express too much.
Yeah.
So I never tried to do that with Brian. I've also met Bonnie Prince Billy twice.
Wow.
But very, very briefly, I've got a photo of me with him at a gig from years and years ago, which I really like. But I do think if I met Nico Case, I would just start to cry, and that would not help anyone.
That probably happens to her a lot, though, to be fair, you can imagine.
I don't know what her fan base is like. Like, I could spot a Queen fan at 50 yards because they'd be wearing a Queen coat they'd made themselves. They're quite unique in that sense, Queen fans.
Yeah.
I could spot a Bonnie Prince Billy fan because they'd be wearing a plaid shirt and black-rimmed glasses, and they would have a beard and probably be going a bit bald. I don't know if I could spot a Nico Case fan.
John, it's such a pleasure to talk about music with you. Thank you so much for going through all of that with us.
Yeah,
and listen, when does your tour start? Presumably you have to write the second half of it first, although at least you have the music sorted out.
Yes, first half is done, second half TBC. It's called Howl, and it starts in September 2023. And I'll be doing something in Edinburgh in August to prepare, but I don't quite know what yet. And it goes all over the shop, really. You can find out ticket links at johnrobbins.com, the website which claims I'm a TV regular.
Listen, if you will it, it'll happen. That's the way I look at these things. Thanks so much, John. It's great talking to you. Really.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if just one person buys Fox Confessor Brings the Flood after listening to this, I will be very,
that's what I'm going to do right now. Right now. Hey listener, thank you so much for listening today. That's your job. You listen, we talk, and that's how we like it. And if you did like it, why not share this little moment of joy that brightens up your Thursday mornings with a friend or even with a stranger? Just share it with anyone. We're not fussy. We just want people to listen to this lovely podcast. So go out there, like, subscribe, and tell someone about the wonderful world of what goes around. What are you building in there?
Trying to do it subtly. Like and subscribe.
There's glass in my thermos and blood on my jeans, nickels and dimes of the 4th of July.